Upending decades of American diplomacy, the US president infuriates Muslim and world leaders by recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Donald Trump also announces plans to move the US embassy. It's a momentous change, but change of what sort? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. For decades, American presidential candidates from both parties have promised to move the US embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. But once elected, they have retreated from the idea. On Wednesday, Donald Trump changed that. Trump overruled his top political and military advisors to recognise Jerusalem as Israel's capital and announced plans to relocate the US embassy. To give you a sense of how unusual that is, of all the countries that maintain formal diplomatic relations with Israel, not one currently has an embassy in Jerusalem. And the few that have had embassies there in the past have been small countries with little connection to the Middle East, such as Costa Rica and El Salvador. Let's hear now from Harry Fawcett in occupied East Jerusalem.
This announcement had been trailed for days. Now it was up to Donald Trump to make the case that a wildly controversial move opposed by the Palestinians, Arab states and most of the international community could advance the peace process.
It would be folly to assume that repeating the exact same formula would now produce a different or better result. Therefore, I have determined that it is time to officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
Trump said he was directing the State Department to begin preparations to move the US embassy to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv. Talk of architects and engineers confirming earlier suggestions that this would be a matter of years, not days.
We are not taking a position of any final status issues, including the specific boundaries of the Israeli sovereignty in Jerusalem or the resolution of contested borders.
Before Donald Trump made this speech, White House officials were trying to frame it, saying that it didn't define the final status of Jerusalem. That could still be negotiated between Israelis and Palestinians in a two-state solution, if that is what both parties still wanted. However, for the Palestinians, this is the United States definitively taking sides in this conflict. In a pre-recorded message, the Palestinian president said Trump was merely encouraging continued occupation.
These denounced and rejected measures create deliberate constraints to all of the efforts towards realizing peace and reflect the United States' withdrawal from practicing its role as a peace mediator.
Israel, too, had prepared its messaging on a day that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called a historical milestone.
The president's decision is an important step towards peace, for there is no peace that doesn't include Jerusalem as the capital of the State of Israel.
Palestinians living in occupied East Jerusalem would have heard little in President Trump's speech, recognizing their own historical connection to the city, which they too view as their capital. Jerusalem's Christian churches warned of conflict, violence and irreparable harm. Donald Trump made reference to a perceived lack of courage on the part of his predecessors who'd failed to make this decision. Now he will have to wait, along with the region, to see what consequences it brings. Harry Fawcett, Al Jazeera, occupied East Jerusalem.
OK, well, let's bring in our guests now. In Amman, we have Mouin Rabbani, he's a senior fellow at the Institute for Palestinian Studies. In Washington, D.C., we have J.D. Gordon. He's a former foreign policy advisor to Donald Trump's presidential campaign. And in London, we have Yossi Meckelberg. He's a professor of international relations at Regent's University. A very warm welcome to all of you. J.D., if I could start with you, why has Trump made this very inflammatory move?
Well, I think that he's following up on things said during the campaign trail. You know, I think it's a smart political move on his part. In the United States, we have about 30% of the population who are evangelical Christians. To them, this is very important, to make Jerusalem the capital, to recognize it as such. And so I think that President Trump has made a very smart political move to appeal to his base.
OK, so it might work domestically, but it's going to have severe repercussions internationally. Did he really take that on board?
I think so, because I think that President Trump understands that Israelis have been targeted by radical Islamic terror groups. Americans have been targeted by radical Islamic terror groups. There's really no peace process to begin with anyway. That's a mirage. And besides, there's a 1995 law in the United States passed by Congress that says we should recognize Jerusalem as the capital. So Americans and Israelis are already targeted worldwide. So this peace process is somewhat of a mirage anyway. This just squares with reality.
I just want to quickly ask about that 1995 law before we move on to our other guests. Why was that law ever recognized by US Congress and passed?
Well, I think that it was politically controversial, and I think that administrations didn't want to put it into effect because they were concerned with a blowback from the Arab world and from Palestinians, from terror groups. So none of the presidents have had the courage to act on it. So this is really the first time in 22 years where we've seen a U.S. president be bold enough to actually take that action.
OK. Moeen Rabbani, do you see it as a bold... I mean, it is a bold move. Is it a correct bold move?
Well, it's a little amusing to see this gross violation of international law and the international consensus presented as somehow courageously standing up to the forces of terror. I will grant one point, which is that it's easy to pin the blame for the current crisis solely on Donald Trump because he's such a volatile airhead. But I think your previous guest correctly points to the 1995 U.S. congressional legislation, which I think it's useful to remember, passed with overwhelmingly bipartisan support and lays the basis for the crisis that we are in now. In other words, you had a piece of American legislation passed very much at the urging of Benjamin Netanyahu, who was then the opposition leader, and the Israel lobby, AIPAC, with the express purpose at the time of trying to scuttle the Oslo agreements, and previous presidents have, of course, signed 6 monthly waivers, but this time, as I think your previous guest also correctly identifies, Trump decided not to for a variety of primarily domestic political reasons. And of course, you know, the recognizing exclusively Israeli sovereign claims over Jerusalem while giving short shrift to any Palestinian rights, and for that matter, to international law, which clearly defines East Jerusalem as occupied territory, which has characterized the Israeli annexation of East Jerusalem as null and void through a Security Council resolution, and an international community that does not recognize the sovereignty of any state over any part of Jerusalem. I mean, presenting this as somehow promoting Israeli-Palestinian or Arab-Israeli peace strikes me as nothing short of thoroughly absurd.
Yossi, I mean, it does just show the US up for what it is and always has been, doesn't it? That it is pro-Israeli.
Well, it's especially with this administration. It's administration that tells us that it's about to initiate a new peace process, but at the same time makes one of the most incendiary moves that one can imagine, dealing with one of the most sensitive, if not the most sensitive issue between the Israelis and Palestinians and in the region. But maybe the speaker from Washington actually gave the game away, because President Trump said, yes, we are taking a different view towards the peace, and now we hear that, oh, there is no peace process at all, so no one actually intends to embark on another initiative because they don't think there is any chance of having it. And I think actually previous presidents were courageous and resisting this temptation of recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Not because for not all means and purposes it's not the capital. Obviously the government sits there, the parliament sits there, the Supreme Court sits there, but recognition was supposed to be part of a mutual peace agreement between the Israel and Palestinians, in which ends with Jerusalem as the capital of both. Bear in mind, 1995 is a completely different time in the history of the conflict. 2 years after Oslo, when anyone would assume that within 2-3 years there would be a peace agreement in which Jerusalem would become the capital of both. 2 years later, the situation is so different, which as a result, we already see violence in the streets of Gaza and Jerusalem, and I think can be definitely attributed to Trump's irresponsible announcement yesterday.
But Yossi, Trump did have a point, doesn't he, when he said that something has to change. I mean, you say that previous presidents were courageous in not recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, but past presidents haven't managed to advance the peace process.
Which is regrettable, and I think we can go through the failure, for instance, of the Kerry initiative, and had been Kerry bold in 2014, as he was bold 1 year ago in his famous speech, which we outlined why did it happen, and actually follow his own advice back in 2014, or Obama should have followed it, maybe would have been in a completely different situation, taking the right decision. Now, I agree with Trump. There is a need to take a different approach, but there is a need to be bold and courageous in bringing both sides to negotiate and deal with all the outstanding issues, not to prejudice, as he did yesterday, one of the most important issues, but have a bold and courageous process which will deal with Jerusalem, will deal with the refugees, deal with the right of self-determination of the Palestinians, deal with the security of both sides, deal with the expansion of settlements. Yes, this is the attitude if one wants to achieve a peace, just peace, and a lasting peace, not to actually side with one of the sides and one of the most crucial issues.
JD, should we perhaps give Trump the benefit of the doubt and see this as a possible part of a greater plan that's yet to be revealed? We've got the Vice President, Mike Pence, in the region in the coming days. We've got Jared Kushner working for months on what's supposed to be revealed as the deal of the century. Are we going to see more moves towards a new peace process?
I think so, and I think that's an excellent question. I think that we should give the president the benefit of the doubt. He was elected to bring change to the United States. President Obama ran on hope and change. I think President Obama brought hope. President Trump is bringing change. So he's seen that this has not worked. There is really no peace process that we can tell because of all the attacks and intifadas over the decades. So I think he's trying a new approach, and we should give him the benefit of the doubt. I also think it's important to understand that millions of Israelis and millions of Palestinians are suffering needlessly. And the main reason is because the Palestinian leadership in the Gaza Strip and West Bank won't compromise to let Israel exist as a Jewish state. In the Gaza Strip, Hamas wants to wipe Israel off the map, and they run the Gaza Strip. In the West Bank, you have the Palestinian Authority, Fatah, and they only want Israel to exist if they accept the right of return, which means millions of Palestinians coming from Lebanon and Jordan, other places, which would make Israel no longer a Jewish majority state. So basically, the Palestinian leadership won't compromise enough to let Israel exist. So it's a non-starter. Of course, we have to come up with a different plan.
OK, so JD raised a lot of points there that are part of a future negotiated settlement, the right of return, the existence of Israel, the boundaries. But are you going to be as kind as JD and see Trump as the agent who can bring change?
Well, that was a valiant attempt to recite the standard AIPAC talking points on obstacles to Israeli-Palestinian peace. But the fact of the matter is that there are two primary issues, as virtually everyone who seriously examined this issue will tell you. The first is the refusal of Israel to relinquish its occupation of the Palestinian territories. And the second is the extreme bias of the United States towards Israel in a situation where it has claimed exclusive supervision of Israeli-Palestinian diplomacy. And Aaron David Miller, for example, a long-standing American peace processor, has stated that one of the main problem was that the United States behaves not as an honest broker or even as a mediator, but as Israel's lawyer when it comes to Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. So to say that the solution is to take even more radical pro-Israeli positions and that this will somehow promote Israeli-Palestinian peace and that, basically categorically dismissing Palestinian rights and interests is somehow going to help us move forward, I think is, you know, it may sound nice to Trump's domestic constituencies, but in the real world of the Middle East, it's not only not going to promote peace, but it's certainly going to make it that much more difficult to address the issue of ending Israeli occupation and therefore finding a pathway towards peaceful Israeli-Palestinian coexistence.
Yossi, would you agree with that? Has the US just lost all legitimacy as a broker in the peace process?
I must admit, I don't think there were many Palestinians that believe in the United States, definitely under Donald Trump being an honest broker. But if they needed any further proof, I think they got it yesterday. At the end of the day, you know, when talking about peace between the Israeli Palestinians and maintaining Israel as Jewish and democratic, only the end of the occupation, ensuring that Israel is within the Green Line or the 4th of June 1967 borders will ensure Jewish and democratic. There is no trick, there is no way in which Israel maintain expanding settlements and occupying the West Bank and East Jerusalem and still staying Jewish and democratic. Yes, it's a complex situation, it's a complex conflict. We can't put all the blame on one side and think the other side is blameless, but this is not the way to deal with it. Only fair and just solution which recognized the political rights, the civil rights, and the human rights of all people between the Jordan River and the sea, and also the Palestinian refugees outside the region, will bring a lasting peace. And I think the last thing we need is the blame game. What's needed is a constructive peace process, which not only the United States is involved, but other elements in the international community, give or take, based on the Clinton parameters, adjusted to the conditions today.
JD, what can the US offer the Palestinians, or what might they offer the Palestinians to entice them back to the table? Because as we've heard, they're not in the best of moods to be negotiating anytime soon now.
Right. Well, the United States has already supported the Palestinians with funds. That's how the Palestinian Authority is able to pay the salaries of the government workers there, because in large part, U.S. funds. But the U.S. could also help the Palestinians to understand that it's very important for the Israelis to maintain a military presence in the Jordan River Valley between the West Bank and Jordan. If Israelis pulled out of that region, which the Palestinian leadership demands they do, it would be suicide for Israel if the king of Jordan should fall, God forbid, because the king of Jordan has been a partner in peace with the United States and with Israel. But if Jordan gets taken over by a hostile regime towards Israel and there are no Israeli troops in that river valley, the Jordan River Valley, it's lights out, suicide for Israel. But the Palestinians won't accept it. So the United States can help persuade the Palestinians that there can be land swaps in the West Bank, Israeli areas for Palestinian areas. There can be land swaps. But it's very important that those Israeli troops stay along that border of Jordan. Otherwise, it's a non-starter. It's suicide for Israel without that.
OK, Moeen, how contentious are those troops there along the Jordanian border?
Well, I think it's important to briefly recapitulate what just happened. You asked the previous speaker what the United States could do to help entice the Palestinians back to the negotiating table, and his response was, well, the incentive for the Palestinians is to help them understand that the Jordan Valley will be under permanent Israeli occupation. In effect, the annexation will extend all the way to the border between the occupied West Bank and Jordan. And I think, unfortunately, this is a very accurate reflection of views in Washington these days, which is an inability to see anything in this region beyond Israeli interests, and to define every Israeli interest, no matter how illegal, no matter how outrageous, as kind of a sacred right. And commensurate with that, the Palestinians have no inalienable rights. There's an increasing view that they don't even constitute a legitimate people, let alone a people with the right to live free of occupation and in an independent and sovereign state, and so on. But look, you know, we keep talking about new negotiations and an ultimate deal and so on. I was always very skeptical that we were ever going to see anything more than hot air from the U.S. peace team. But to the extent that there was any substance to that, I think yesterday's announcement has made it irrelevant, either because the Palestinian leadership will now conclude that it has to break with this effort, or because any continued involvement by this leadership with the American effort will so delegitimize it that it will be unable to participate in any meaningful way.
JD, Moeen's right, isn't it? I mean, you just said exactly what the Palestinians need to do, but what do the Israelis need to do?
Well, I think the Israelis need to keep making their case to the international community and to the United States that in order to survive, there just can't be withdrawal to the 1967
No,
borders.
I mean, what do they need to do to create an atmosphere for negotiations?
Well, they just need to keep reminding the Palestinians that there has to be a compromise between both sides. The Israelis,
but that doesn't sound like much of a compromise, JD. That's my point. What are the compromise efforts that the Israelis need to do?
Well, land swaps. I mean, that's what the Israelis have been talking about. Land swaps in the West Bank, where Palestinians will have their own sovereign area within the West Bank, and Israelis will move out of there. But as a precondition to that, there has to be a military buffer. We're not talking about an occupation of the entire West Bank here. We're talking about a military series of outposts along the border with Jordan. That is not something that's going to infringe upon Palestinian sovereignty.
Okay.
But
let's just try and move it forward a little bit then. Let's try and move it forward. Yossi, let's bring you in here. And do you think that there's any way that we can see any advancement of the Oslo peace process at this point in time?
I think it's very difficult to see considering the conditions, but I think what we hear from the previous speaker is the kind of perception of peace which is outdated. Everything about the peace is seen through military and security conditions, not thinking that it's actually about peace and coexistence and reconciliation between two people. This is what secures the peace between the two people, understanding each other and recognizing each other legitimate rights for self-determination, that both of them has a claim for the place there and living together. No one suggests that there won't be military presence along the Jordan River or the Jordan Valley for quite some time. But this is just as an interim term. The long term is reduce the motivation to try to harm each other. Now, it's not going to be applicable if any of the sides, including the United States, will take unilateral measures. What we need to see exactly the opposite by bringing the sides, negotiating, addressing what has been addressed in many ways for such a long time, and having leaderships on both sides. And also in the international community, they are ready to push the sides to the finishing line, addressing all the issue, because there are economic sides to this, there is human rights aspects to this, addressing the religious side, developing the business on both sides that create jobs, because talk about hope and change. The way that it's right now, what Trump is presenting is hopeless and changeless.
Okay.
And that's the opposite of what we need.
Well, let's just let JD have a chance to answer that. JD, into the last minute that we have, this unilateral action by Trump, hasn't it forced him to sabotage his own peace initiative?
No, I don't think so, because he sees that the current situation is not working. He's going to try a fresh approach. And also, I think that right now he's under such attack for this Trump-Russia hoax of the century that he's looking for other things for people to talk about. I think the political left is pushing him into a corner. So he's trying to change the narrative. And I think he should do it because there's a terrible witch hunt going on against him.
There we will have to leave our discussion for today. Many thanks to all our guests for joining us, Moeen Rabbani, JD Gordon and Yossi Mechelberg. And thank you too very much for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, bye for now.